about separating dreadlocks. Cutting versus pulling. Separating is an important, sort of annoying, potentially uncomfortable, and sometimes a quite unknown part of dreadlock maintenance. And by that I mean there are a lot of people who start their dreadlock journey not even realizing that they will have to separate the dreadlocks back out again to stop them from knotting together. I'm not going to go into too much detail with regards to the separation process as a whole. If you want to know more about separating dreadlocks at the roots, you'll find a link to my separating dreadlocks at the roots video in the description below. In this video, if you've read the title or listened to my introduction, you'll know I'm going to be talking about the differences between separating dreadlocks with cutting versus separating dreadlocks via pulling. Very briefly, dreadlocks are formed from hairs that have knotted together, and hairs can't think, at least as far as I know. Hairs don't have conscious thought, so they can't decide which hairs they're going to knot with. They're just going to knot with hairs that are nearby. Now sometimes those are going to be hairs that are within their own section. These are hairs that you want them to knot with, those are hairs within their correct dreadlock, but sometimes they're going to knot with neighbour dreads, because you've got two dreadlocks next to each other. Sometimes those loose hairs are going to knot with loose hairs in the neighbour dreadlock, and that will cause the two dreadlocks to get knotted together. If you do not deal with this, if you don't separate them back out again, those two dreadlocks can get more and more knotted together. Eventually they can fuse at the root and grow out as congo dreadlocks, which, hey, that is what some people are looking for. I would say I have more than my fair share of congo dreadlocks, but it's not what everyone is looking for and not what everyone is looking for across their entire head. And so to stop your dreadlocks from all knotting and fusing together, you have to separate them. Separating is a completely normal part of dreadlocks maintenance. Everyone's dreadlocks will require some degree of separation, some people's more than others, and young dreadlocks a lot more than older dreadlocks. Some people will find with their young dreadlocks that they have to separate pretty much every single day to keep on top of it, and when you're doing something every single day, you can kind of wonder, is this the best way to do it? Is there another way to do it? And so I often get asked, cutting versus pulling. So I'll start with pulling. What's pulling all about? When you're separating with pulling, you just grab the two dreadlocks that have started to knot together and pull them in opposite directions. When you do that, it's going to pull on the hairs that are binding the two dreadlocks, and it will either lead to those hairs getting pulled out of the wrong dreadlock, getting pulled out of the neighbour dread, or getting broken, freeing up the two dreadlocks once again. Pulling is generally the most common way of separating dreadlocks. It's so common, in fact, that when people refer to separating dreadlocks, they're generally simply referring to pulling dreadlocks apart. Pulling, however, is not always the most comfortable of things to do. It can take quite a while to work your way along a dreadlock and deal with all the knots along the length. Depends how many binding hairs you've got, and it can be quite uncomfortable and sometimes even painful when separating right down to the root, because you can end up with binding hairs that pull on root hairs, pull on hairs that are directly attached to the scalp, and that can, be painful, be pulling on your hair. So when people have to separate very often with their young dreadlocks and it is uncomfortable, they will often consider, can't I just cut these apart? Which leads me on to cutting conveniently. Now I probably don't need to go into too much detail, the specifics of cutting dreadlocks apart. It's kind of self-explanatory. You have the two dreadlocks that are bound together, you get scissors and you cut those binding hairs. It is obviously a lot quicker, simpler and pain-free because you just get scissors and snip, they're separated. So why, if cutting is so much quicker and simpler and pain-free, why is pulling the more recommended way to do it? Why would anyone recommend pulling over cutting if it seems, more complicated and uncomfortable? Okay, so there are a couple of reasons why I recommend pulling over cutting. When you pull dreadlocks apart, you get the two dreadlocks, you pull them apart, you either pull those binding hairs out of the neighbour dread, or you break the hairs and you end up with a sort of frizzy fuzz of newly loose hair. Okay, so this doesn't sound like a positive point for the pulling, but wait, stick with me. Actually, first it's going to sound a little bit worse. Generally people don't like having loose hair, so the thought of separating dreadlocks to end up with more visible loose hair doesn't sound like the most appealing of things, especially when you get that loose hair. You can't even guarantee that it's not just going to go straight away and not back into the neighbour dread and require separating again. But that loose frizz, that fuzz that you get from the separating, those newly freed up hairs, they're given a second chance to knot up in the correct place. So you free those hairs back up again. Some of them are going to go on to knot into the correct dreadlock. Once they're locked in for good. Don't have to worry about them anymore. They will not need to be separated again. Obviously some of them are going to go and knot with a neighbour dread again, and that's quite annoying, but you just separate them back out again, give them another chance. So you just like separate, give them another chance, nope, try again, nope, try again. Over time you're going to have fewer and fewer hairs to separate back out again, and you'll have more and more hairs knotting up into their correct dreadlock. Now if you were to cut the binding hairs instead, you are still going to end up with the loose hairs. The only difference here is you're going to be cutting those binding hairs down the middle. You're not going to be pulling them out of the dreadlocks. And this can often lead to those loose hairs that are then sticking out to be too short to be able to knot back up again. And so instead of having a loose frizz that can actually form new knots and knot into dreadlocks, you instead have loose hairs that are sort of poking out like a fuzz of loose hairs that have been cut, and they can remain, and as the dreadlocks grow out, you have dreadlocks which have fuzz stuff sticking out. If you cut, you're therefore not really giving the hair the opportunity to try again at knotting in the right place. Now the second reason, and the main reason that I don't recommend separating via cutting in situations where you can separate via pulling, is because using scissors can be dangerous. Now this isn't a don't run with scissors type thing, it's not, because scissors in general can be dangerous. I assume you're all responsible adults and know how to use scissors. But going near the roots of your dreadlocks, especially when those roots are still young, soft, and pretty much just loose hairs, if you're going in there with scissors to try and cut other loose binding hairs, it's pretty easy to end up in trouble. You have to be incredibly careful to only cut the binding hairs and not anything else. There is a very real danger of accidentally snipping root hairs. If you do that, you're going to permanently damage the dreadlock at that point. Even as the dreadlock grows out, it's going to be permanently weakened in the spot where you damaged it while it was still at the root level. And in extreme cases, you can end up with dreadlocks being so compromised at the root that they fall off completely. Now that's obviously the most extreme of results, but unfortunately it can happen, and I have seen it happen. And there's not really a whole lot you can do to go back and fix that. For the reason that cutting accidents can and do happen, I would highly recommend getting someone else to do the separation via cutting for you. Maybe if you've got one right along your forehead, you can snip it yourself. But anywhere else, you're really going to want to get someone else to do it for you. It's way too easy to cut something that you don't want to cut when you're going in at an awkward angle and you have to do it in the mirror so it's backwards. It's just all too easy to end up cutting something that you don't want to get cut. If I end up in a situation where something needs to be cut apart, I do not do it myself. Incredibly awkward to work with scissors in spots that you can't see and in the mirror. It's not worth the risk. So for me, cutting doesn't really cut it. I don't personally think that using scissors for your regular separation is all that practical, especially when you've got young dreadlocks and you can find that you have to separate in some cases every single day. If you're going in and having to separate every single day and you're using scissors, it's just going to become way too easy to become too comfortable with it and cut something you don't want to get cut. There are, however, some situations that really do require the use of scissors. And this is when two or more dreadlocks become too knotted up for pulling to be effective. Separating via pulling only works when the dreadlocks themselves are thicker and stronger than the binding hairs. The dreadlocks are rope, the binding hairs are string. So if you're keeping on top of it, not going to be a worry. But if you leave it for too long, if you give those binding hairs long enough, you get more and more of them, you can end up in situations where those binding hairs become as strong as the dreadlocks themselves. This is going to happen faster if you have thinner dreadlocks, because obviously those thinner dreadlocks are not as strong as thicker dreadlocks, so it's not going to take as long for those binding hairs to build up the same number and strength. In such situations, those binding hairs are not going to easily give way when you try and separate them, and in some cases it would really not be recommended to just keep pulling and pulling and pulling, because if the binding hairs have become so thick that they're as strong as the dreadlocks, you don't know what's going to give first. If you pull hard enough, you might end up damaging the dreadlocks before you damage the binding hairs. So in such situations, then you're going to want to get someone to go in with the scissors. So this is why you're going to want to keep on top of your separating to avoid situations where you're forced to cut, because if you leave dreadlocks long enough for the roots to fuse together, they're no longer two dreadlocks knotted together. You've just got one dreadlock root that turns into two dreadlock tips. Okay, so there we go. That's cutting versus pulling. Personally, I always recommend going for the pulling option whenever it's possible. So as long as your dreadlocks haven't completely fused together, you should be able to get away with using the pulling option. Use it little and often, just keep on top of it. You don't have to work all the way down to your scalp every single time. If it's hurting, stop. If you find it too uncomfortable, try doing it while the dreadlocks are wet. Just work on it when you've got a bit of spare time, little bits every now and then. As long as you're doing it faster than they're knotting together, then you're not going to end up in any issues. Dreadlocks are always going to need separating to some degree. It's not something to be worried about or scared about. They're hairs that knot together. It's part of the process. Just get in there and work on them with your hands. Get to know your dreadlocks. If you have any questions, comments, queries regarding separating dreadlocks or dreadlocks in general, you can get in touch with me via the comment section below. I will get back to you. If you liked this video, if you found it helpful, useful, enjoyable, you can click the like button. If you'd like to see more videos from me in the future, you can of course click that subscribe button. If you're looking for dreadlocks tips, help, advice, guides, tutorials, videos, you can find all my stuff on lazydreads.com. I'd like to thank you guys for watching. I hope to see you again next time. Farewell!